Welcome back, artists. I'm Waiya Paints, and today is an auspicious day because I'm recording this on my birthday. Yep, that's right. I'm officially years old, and I'm starting to feel the age these days. And it's times like this that I get extra nostalgic. Thankfully, 3DXFiles had the perfect model to capture that part of my youth and became this week's sponsor by releasing my third comic book crush, Zor-el, Supergirl. Now, unlike my usual builds, this one doesn't have an overload of details. It's more of a serene, uncluttered display. This means that there's going to be fewer choices to make, but it also means each one of those choices are going to have a bigger impact on our final look. And cards on the table, I actually changed my mind mid-project and had to repaint parts. Twice. So, join me over at the painting table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Now, Kara's base is a super clean cloud formation, and while I did prime in gray, I wanted to lay down a base with ash gray. Now, the light gray prime was mainly for easy painting, as I know nearly every part will need to be light and bright for the final tone. So a gray primer saves a ton of time, as it won't need as many coats to get full opacity. But besides that, the finish of the primer is super flat compared to my acrylic paint. So if I was to use this for the base, it would look kind of patchy with areas of satin finish mixed in. For a simple step-up highlight, Spaceship Exterior. Here, I'm using a fairly heavy-handed dry brush, just to ensure I'm catching all the volumes of this cloud. In hindsight, there was a point about right here where I could have stopped, and it would have looked fantastic. But I kept going just to show how much wiggle room you have when it comes to overdoing it. As you can tell, it still looks great, just not as soft and a bit more chonkers of a highlight. Thankfully, with such a clean base, it shouldn't draw too much attention to itself directly. As long as it's a typical cloud color, you can get away with a bit of an overzealous highlight. As a final peak highlight, dead white. This is one of the few circumstances where I use pure white. Along with black, it's usually ill-advisable to use either. In my experience, black ends up losing a lot of detail definition, while white has the opposite effect of showing too much surface definition. So normally when you want to paint white, you should pick a very light neutral gray, like Spaceship Exterior. It'll read as white without the shortcomings. The great thing about knowing the basics to why there is a rule is it lets us know when and how we should break it. Here, I want to lean into that extra texture that white tends to give. So pure white it is, or in this case, dead white. To complete the base, I need to paint these three little burbs. Now, whenever I paint things that actually exist, the first step is to have a clear mental image of what a seagull looks like. And don't shame me here, but even though I live 40 minutes from the beach, I was drawing a complete blank at what this bird looks like, and I had to look it up. Judging from photos, the most common gull has white plumage with gray wings and black tips, along with yellow feet and a beak that sometimes has a spot of red. So I started them off with a base of foggy gray. This is not the step for cleanliness, just pure speed. And even though I used a gray primer, this is going to take a couple of coats to get a fully opaque base. For the beaks and feet, I used this dingy yellow gold base. These are very small areas, so a detail brush will come in handy to control how much paint touches your model, which is important, as cleaning up overspill on a very light gray will eat up time. Just repeat the mantra, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Painting it clean the first time will save the most time. For the gray feathers on the wing, I hopped back to ash gray and roughly stippled it on, as I wanted a very irregular edge to it, just to help give the impression of feathers. Next, each of the wingtips got its own slightly unique pattern with black. And I do know what I just said about using black, but I'm a rebel and a rule breaker. Plus, it's my birthday. Finally, I came back in with the foggy gray to brighten up the trailing edge and add a bit of molting on top of the darker gray. If this was printed at a bigger scale, it'd be worth trying to define each sculpted feather. But at this scale, I'm opting to keep it simple. and with the base all dry fitted, it was looking like it was gonna turn out great. Now to move on to Kara, starting with her boots. And I really want to go for super shiny patent leather thigh highs. To start us off, vermilion. Normally, I would start my reds with a much darker tone so they'd end up richer, but here I'm going for vibrancy. So starting with my brightest and most saturated red seemed like the play. But going for this intense of a red leaves me in a bit of a pickle on how I'm gonna highlight this, because it's already my brightest. The first guess might be to add white, as usually color plus white equals lighter shade of that color. But when you add white to red, you don't get a lighter red, you get pink. And because of the heavy white pigment, pink is quite opaque. So even a little bit will completely dominate the red and make the shoes look more pink than red. So instead, I grabbed Sunrise Orange. Mixing in a bit of a bright orange can give you a little bit more headroom for highlighting red. Additionally, like red, orange acrylics are more on the transparent side, so it won't really change how this red highlight covers. That transparency lets the underlying reds show through, and is going to make it super easy to blend it with the boot. You can also use a bright yellow for this, but beware, being a little too heavy-handed will end up looking a little too orange. That's why starting with orange gives you a bit of a safety net. After they were highlighted, I gave them a few coats of gloss varnish and left them to dry. For the skirt, I wanted to go for a darker red to show the difference in fabric, so I'll definitely need to start with a more broodier tone, like terracotta. This is a slightly brown red that leaves a ton of headroom for highlighting, while also not being so dark that it looks dingy. I followed this up with a quick highlight dry brush of vermilion. Since I only want to hit the tops of the folds, it's important to keep the brush stroke perpendicular to them. And don't forget to watch for overloading on your brush. You want to build up a soft glow. Leaving a large streak would force me to rebase and start over. Time to paint her torso and arms. Painting these as separate pieces means the seams on the shoulder will still be visible, but in any case like this where there would naturally be a seam from the clothing, they can be easily ignored. It's always nice when the sculptor does well thought out cuts to make my job easy. To start us off on the torso, Magic Blue. As with all base painting, the goal is to get down thin layers of color until you have a fully opaque coat. So grab a floofy brush, have fun, and go fast. For a highlight, Andrea Blue was mixed in with the Magic Blue to make what I like to call a half-step highlight. By virtue of using the base color and then mixing in a lighter color, we make whisper soft highlights, which became sort of the theme for Supergirl. And I think it adds a bit of contrast separation from the base. So long as we maintain this style, it'll give the piece a more elevated look. Just make sure you keep the paint load very light. That way you can easily build up the highlight in all the areas that make sense, like the upper chest and shoulders. It's also a good idea to hold her arms in place so that you can be sure you're highlighting them to the same level as the torso. To do the S on her chest, I started with Blonde Shadow. Now, as a part of my own personal taste, I think having a slightly less vibrant yellow lets the red and blue shine a bit more. If I go super vibrant with yellow, they end up fighting for visibility. And besides, bright yellows tend to face all the same texture issues as white does. After laying down a base, I highlighted with pale saffron. Using the dusty yellow as an undertone makes it a lot easier to get full coverage. Once the yellows were established, it was time for vermilion to come in and embolden the S. This is one of those paint within the line parts. Just go slow and utilize the side of your brush to get clean lines. And before you know it, the emblem will be filled out and you'll be ready to move on. Before I move on to the skin, I'd like to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Each month, your generosity is much appreciated. I'm getting closer and closer to an upgrade on my paint set. That way, I can use a unified paint set so it's a whole lot easier for you to follow along at home, compared to pulling from like 6 different paint lines. If you would like to join the painting pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. I'd also like to say a special thank you to 3DXFiles for providing today's STL. And I've gotta say, very nice. If you would like to get your hands on this STL and many other models, be sure to check out the link below to their Patreon and storefront. I'm sure you're going to find something awesome. For now, let's get back to work. Time to handle that skin. And I had the idea of a pretty fair but peachy skin, so I grabbed some light tones. But truth be told, she quickly started giving me Harley Quinn vibes, so I hit the brakes and had a second go at it with sanguine and plain old flesh. Sometimes you get an idea and it works, other times it doesn't. Keeping the ego in check to be able to make that call and change course tends to lead to better results. So I started building up the skin tone through successive layers until I hit a natural looking color. Over large smooth surfaces like the thighs, I tend to keep the highlights pretty even. And while I do try to preserve some shadows on the face, it's nowhere near as much as I would with a male face. While the face fully dried, I moved on to the hair, starting with the blonde shadow that I used before. My favorite shade of blonde has always been slightly dirty, so that's what I'm going to go for here. And lucky me, one of the perks of the comic multiverse is that I can paint a wholly original version of the character I want. Now, I wanted to beef up the shadows on the hair a touch, so I thinned down some light tone and gave the hair an all-over wash. Thinning it down here helps prevent overshading and lowers the surface tension a bit so it flows better. Afterwards, I needed to knock down some of the more dramatic shadows with a quick touch up of the blonde shadow. A light hand here can quickly define the volumes of hair. Just be careful not to overdo it or you'll need to re-establish your shadows. For the first level of highlight, I used the gold base from earlier, mainly because I still had it out, but also it looks good on top of this blonde. But remember, this is a highlight. You want to keep this light and reserve for just the peaks of the hair plumes. Be ready to pump the brakes as soon as you see the color shifting up. As a final highlight, pale saffron. Even though I want a dusky blonde, it still needs a few golden peaks here and there. Otherwise, there's a risk of the hair looking more brown than blonde. But this needs to be super light, just enough to pick up the modeled hair texture. A little bit will go a long way here. Next, a bit of light gray lays down the base for the eyes and teeth. Try to paint clean here. You can clean up the edges later, but it's good to practice. Next, I wanted to add a bit of color around the edge using a thinned down red wash. Even thinned down, you may get some staining on the middle of the eye. If this does happen, a dot of light gray should reset the brightness. Next, I gave her symmetrical Andrea blue irises. The rule of thumb here is that you want the iris to take up about a third of the eye. You can go bigger, but that tends to give more of an anime style look. While here, I'm leaning more towards a Justice League Unlimited look with minimal makeup, and it's not because I'm bad at makeup. One other thing to keep in mind when putting in the irises is to make sure they're looking at something, or your model will look a bit aloof. Now, I want to keep her makeup minimal because I'm bad at makeup, but she will need at least a little bit of lip gloss. Thankfully, it'll only take a few precise strokes and then you'll be done. So take them slow and make them deliberate. To add a bit of detail to the teeth, I gave each one a tiny little dot of dead white. It's not completely necessary, but if you're feeling confident, give it a shot. Now to add pupils, I got these nail kit dot tools and they work great. This has a surface similar to a ballpoint pen. So to control the dot size, you're going to want to test it out on your hand. The first tap will almost always be too much, but by the second or third dot, you should see your ideal size. Judging from this, I want the third one. Now that I know this, I can reload the tool and burn those first few dots before I touch the model and add those light reflections. Now to do the trim on our suit, I picked out an old favorite, Sycorax Bronze. Now, unfortunately, I don't know where I put my new airbrush thinner. I have a bad habit of putting stuff in weird places and losing them for weeks. One time I put my phone in my freezer and I didn't find it for like 3 days. So here, I ended up thinning my metallic with water. And I can't forget about the trim on the boots. Their candy coat came out perfect, and this trim is just the finishing touch. Now, I don't want to dwell on our undergarments too long, but since some of you would like to know, they were vermilion with gold trim, but no peeking. Now, this car was modeled holding a cat, and I don't know if canonically she has a specific cat or not, but I decided to paint this one more like my neighbor's cat, Sizzler. Now, Sizzler had a dark brown, almost black coat with tiny tufts of gray hair mixed in. So after a hardened carapace base, got a stipply dry brush of light gray. A bit of patchiness here gives off a natural variance. And I'm not going to paint the collar because Sizzler never wore a collar. While he was my neighbor's cat, he was nobody's pet. Coming to the cape as the last major part to paint, I took the same approach as with the boots, with a vermilion base, followed by a highlight fortified with orange. Try to keep this light and focused on the billows and you'll get good results. This is about time when I came back to this skirt. Next to the cape and boots, it was a little bit too dark, so I painted it to match just the same with the vermilion and orange mix-in highlight. Just don't forget to get the underside as well, along with the edge. After that, I called her done. And she is looking good! I'm definitely getting Justice League Unlimited vibes, and it ended up balancing really well with the cloud base. But what do you all think? Is this a model that you'd like to conquer? If so, then head over to 3DXFiles and get your hands on this and many other high quality STLs. And get those warm fuzzy feels knowing that your purchase is helping support an artist. They sponsored this video, so they seem pretty cool to me. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe. The YouTube community is cruising up to 1600 faster than I thought it would. Hi new people, and don't worry, I didn't spend my whole birthday recording and editing. I went to my homing's opening night. Fun times. But as usual, there's always another project waiting to get done. So, until I see you again, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.